Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Okar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. I hope you're all doing well. Here in New York City, fall is in full swing, but I'm delighted to bring some warmth to you with a fantastic talk with Professor Brian Brege, who is joining us from Chicago today. He's an associate professor of history at Syracuse University and a full-term and long-term fellow at the Newberry Library. He is the author of Tuscany in the Age of Empire, and currently he is in collaboration with a number of distinguished scholars working on an exhibition titled Global Florence, the World of Francesco Carletti, 1573 to 1636. We will have another talk on this exhibition in a few weeks, but today we're all here to listen to Professor Brege to hear all about his research. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Professor.
Well, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And now let me see if, without further ado, I can share the screen and we'll see if is that all working?
Perfect. Beautiful.
In which case I'll set my timer to try to make sure that I stay within the window here and
Thank
get
you.
us going.
Thank you.
Now, at least because as you'll see here, there's a fair bit of ground to cover, so I will attempt to move through things expeditiously, but we'll be happy to answer any questions or elaborate at the end. So as you can see, here we're going to be working through the Carletti project. I'll begin with an overview of the project, a brief summary of the journey, and some of the results that we might care about for that journey, and then give you a preview first of the edited volume and some of my findings in my chapters in that volume, and then we'll close with a discussion of the Global Florence exhibition to be held at the Laurenziana. But all right, so as you can see, the Carletti project has been going for some time. We sort of launched it in 2018, and after a few pandemic-induced delays, eventually had a workshop at I Tatti following 7 Zoom seminars in 2021. We had the workshop or conference called Carletti's World, an early modern global voyage in 2022, out of which emerged the edited volume, Trading at the Edge of Empires, which involves almost all of the participants from that conference, and then actually a dozen more beside, as you'll see. That volume is currently in page proofs, and we expect it out in February next year. And as you'll see, 2026 involves, I hope, a rich harvest of things Carletti. Okay. So the question at some level is then, well, why should we care about Carletti, and what, in fact, is this journey about on which we've been working? So here in brief is the journey in summary. It will be coming out in the book itself, so you'll be able to see this map and some detailed exposition about the European section as well. But here I'll carry us through it briefly, and then, of course, I'll be happy to return to other episodes. Okay. So Carletti left Florence in 1591 at only 18 years old to go to Seville to go work in the service of Niccolo Parenti. And his father joins him 2 years later. So at this point in time, he's about 20. And his father, Antonio, helps to make an arrangement with the unnamed Castilian wife of the peasant merchant Cesare Arancini, in which Francesco Carletti serves as her false proxy. He needs to do this because trade in both the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire is restricted to certain subjects of those empires, in particular to subjects of those empires from the Iberian Peninsula. And there are, though they have the same monarch at this point, Philip II, there are internal barriers to trade between the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Nothing daunted, the Carletti, smugglers that they end up being, decide to break more or less all of these rules. So this starts with Antonio doubting that his son was really quite ready for the journey, and illicitly joining as a mariner on the way down to Cape Verde on a slaving expedition to Cape Verde. Here's another representation of the journey, and the heart of what I want to show here is that though Carletti spends some 15 years away from Florence, the heart of the journey is between 1594 and 1602. And the real transition point, as Carletti marks it, is not, as we might imagine, between the Americas and Asia, but instead between Manila and Nagasaki, because it is when he leaves Manila in 1597 that he leaves the Spanish world. Okay, this is the Spanish world where he had lived for more than 2 years in Spain, and we have to assume at this point in time, we have some evidence for this, that he speaks Spanish well enough to pass as Spanish. It's in Cape Verde that the Carletti acquire the enslaved people who they will take on the Middle Passage, an experience that Carletti finds horrifying. And he insists later on that the various negative things that happen in their journey are penance for this original sin, even though he claims with some legal justification that in service of his father at the time, he's sort of not fully an adult. Be that as it may, they go to Cartagena, where they're promptly arrested, or Francesco is promptly arrested, only for a timely letter from one of the Medici to secure their release. This gets them authorization from the local governor to trade throughout the Spanish Americas, which they use to head down to Peru, having made a loss on their sale of enslaved people. That didn't there acquire silver, which they bring up to New Spain, to what we now know as Mexico. Carletti, echoing a judgment of not a few people now, is quite negative on Acapulco and thinks that Mexico City is an earthly paradise. I leave Acapulco aside, but join him on Mexico City as quite a desirable locale. And from there, they decide not to use this authorization as originally intended to trade between New Spain and Peru, but instead to go back into smuggling. And in this case, to pay a bribe, to smuggle their silver to Manila there with the goal of acquiring Chinese goods. But because of this fire in Manila, those goods are not available. And they find that they're unable really to return back to New Spain in the way that they intend. So they end up deciding instead to go again illicitly at midnight on a Japanese grain trader, making for Nagasaki. And the goal there is to leave the Spanish world and enter the Portuguese one without directly violating the barriers to travel and trade between Spanish Manila and Portuguese Macau. The Portuguese ship ends up not arriving, but they are there in time to see the 26 martyrs, the first of the sort of major executions associated with the Japanese repression of Christianity in Nagasaki up on the crucifixes. And also to acquire 5 enslaved Koreans at an extraordinarily low price for 12 scudi, who are captives from the Indian War, then ongoing in Korea. And it is with this group in tow that they head to Macau on a ship that is making for Cochin, China, what we would now say is Vietnam. And again, they put in at midnight to the Jesuit college in Macau, who the Jesuits protect their goods in Macau, and the Carletti the next day are arrested. But because of the death of Antonio Carletti in Macau, Francesco is let off. There's some more to that story, which we'll come back to in just a little bit. After a year and a half in Macau, he makes a brief stop in Malacca, in what it's now Malaysia, before heading to Goa for another long stay. And he leaves Goa in 1601 on the Carrera to India with a large cargo of Japanese goods, porcelain and other musk and other valuable goods. His fortune ostensibly made, only for the Dutch to intercept his ship at St. Helena. And seize his goods, at which point he replies, in effect, you can't do this to me, I'm Italian, and begins a lawsuit, which is eventually settled with Grand Ducal and Marie de Medici, the Queen of France's intercession in 1605 in the Netherlands. That's the journey. It's quite the story in total. Some of the results of the journey then are that Carletti leaves us with the first extensive narrative of a circumnavigation undertaken sort of entirely on existing commercial routes. His legal case in the Dutch Republic sets pretty important precedents. It's eventually settled on political grounds. The Duke says, in effect, it would be a pity if something bad happened to the Dutch ships in Livorno, and the Dutch think it would indeed. So pay Carletti, not as much as Carletti wants, but 13,000 scudi, some serious money. And this sets an important precedent on maritime law, and right at the outset of VOC. It involves Hugo Grotius. It's an important story there. He comes back to Florence bearing a quite rare Ming Chinese atlas with annotations and partial translations, now held at the BNCF. And with him is one of the Koreans. All five have been manumitted in India, and this one, who was only known by the name given to him later as Antonio, is, as best we can tell, the first Korean of whom we have a reasonable record to end up in Europe. And then Carletti returns to Florence, and I'll come back to a little bit of what he did there. So this is his discussion of the Atlas, which he embeds in his account to the Grand Duke, which is originally delivered orally, we think, between 1606 and 1609, and then edited into the written form, which exists only in manuscript and not in the autograph manuscript, dating to 1616, 17, thereabouts. Here's the Atlas, just two pictures from the BNCF, and again, we can return to that, but you can see that there are a few annotations or more on other pages. This whole thing is based on the Carletti manuscript held at the Biblioteca Angelica. There are, as far as we're aware, 5 surviving manuscript accounts of Carletti's journey. This appears to be the oldest. All right, so having gone through the journey and some of the results of this here, I want to tell you a little bit about the volume. The volume is Trading at the Edge of Empires, Francesco Carletti's World, circa 1600, is coming out with the I Tatti Research Series. It comes in 7 parts, along with an introduction written with Paula Findlen and Giorgio Riello. The first part on trade, traders, and travelers involves an essay that I've written, which I'll tell you about in a little bit, and pieces by Cori Tazzara and Luca Molà. The second part on ethics, religion, and slavery, again, dealing with that slave trading, involves essays by Trevor Bernard on the Atlantic side, on Stuart McManus on the Asian side, on Eugenia Menegon and Ina Park. And then our third part is on the edge of global empires, involving pieces from Yun Casalia, Daniela Blechmar, George Flores, Marika Kadlosek, Leah Swan. And as you can see in this brief preview of this, and again, I'll be happy to return to any of it, we have Spanish and Portuguese and Dutch empires. There's a lot going on here. And indeed, part of the premise of the project is that Carletti's journey intersects with so many different historiographies, so many different language traditions, that the only real way to engage with that, sort of nobody has the erudition individually, is to do so through a group project, and an increasingly large group project. Because this would be a normal size volume, and this is more or less the scale of the conference, but we opted not to limit it that way. But instead, to continue, we have another part 4 here on language, vision, and values, with essays by Mackenzie Cooley, Anna Harritson, and Nikki Sugiura. Part on ethnography, cartography, and cosmography, with pieces by Ines Supinoff, Jean-Paul Rubies, Michele Bisotti, and Guido van Meersbergen. And the 6th with essays by some of the editors, including Paula Findlen, Liam Markey, Riello. And then the 7th part with 2 final essays, with the second one of mine, which originally part of the introduction until the introduction grew too massive. And you'll see why, I hope, in just a sec, as when I give you some quick preview of some of those findings, and then finally a piece by Luca Molà. Right, so that whirlwind presentation, I will be happy to elaborate further on, but I want to make sure that we have we have plenty of time to tell the story, but there we have 24 essays in what is a 500-something page volume, perhaps more. We're currently in page proofs and sorting out all of the delicate details of multilingual bibliography and currently we're still expecting that to come out on the original timetable, and that volume can be found outside of Italy through Harvard University Press's website. Okay, in the remaining time that I'd like to speak to, I want to focus first on basically on my first and second essays in that volume to give you some sense of what we're doing, and then I wanted to turn to the Global Florence exhibit. Okay, so the first section here is on patrician commerce in maritime Asia. And here I want to return to that initial story that I mentioned just during Carletti's time in Seville, is in service of Piccolo Parenti, right, and our connection to the Baroncini. And what we can see here is that the Carletti are an established merchant family. In fact, we've been able to trace them 2 generations back in the project, not only his father, but also his grandfather. And they seem to have operated at a sort of middling commercial level. They're by no means either the smallest or the largest merchants in Florence, but they're tied to some really big players, including especially the Caponi, and of course to the Medici directly. And that connection seems to have strengthened upon their return, last connection on their return to Florence. So you'll see here is a set of coat of arms, often from a later period, but it gives an indication of it's not perhaps totally rigorous account of who's a patrician and who's not in a technical political sense. But it gives you a sense of the prominence of these families. These are the Carletti are by no means obscure. They're also by no means one of the largest of the families. And so we can see this then as sort of functionally a Tuscan patrician enterprise. And part of the argument I'd like to make and try to make in this and in other pieces is that it is these established families who develop overlapping networks, really thin, but effective ones, both within the Florentine commercial community and with people from other commercial centers, not just in Italy, but also from South Germany and elsewhere, that enable Florentines to engage in trade and to acquire objects and many more things besides all over the world. Right. Which takes me to the case of Orazio Neretti. So here we have Carletti relating with tears in the eyes, counting to him, this is to Orazio Neretti, the death of my father. Told him about it, and at that time, we pleased each other and became good and cordial friends to each other in the space of 17 months. We were in the same city, nearly together for the closeness of the houses, and for love of him, I waited that year to go to India with the thought of making the voyage to Japan in his company. But I was impeded by the misfortune that befell the ship. Okay, the sort of the heart of the story here is that 10 days after his father dies, Moretti meets Orazio Neretti in Macau. Moretti has, by this point in time, become an established merchant on the India, Macau, Japan leg within the Portuguese Empire. And for a time, Carletti toys with the idea, with it, of joining Neretti on this established trade between Macau and Japan, taking advantage of important price differentials between Japan and China. And the question is then, how did Neretti get there? It turns out Neretti had been in Portuguese Asia for quite some time, and we know a fair bit about him. He had gone originally to Lisbon with Filippo Sassetti, and he had joined Sassetti and the gentleman Charles Bongomonti in Goa in the 1580s after an initial failed voyage. And it is from Goa that Filippo Sassetti, who is a better educated merchant humanist, who had been based in Goa for a number of years as the agent of the contractors holding the pepper monopoly, portion of the pepper monopoly. And it is from Goa in 1586 that Filippo Sassetti writes back asking for Medici intercession for permission to undertake an illegal journey. A journey that violated a very recent prohibition on trade between the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Sassetti imagines that this sort of thing is possible, and of course Carletti attempts it, because Philip II had seized power in Portugal following a succession crisis in 1580, called the Iberian Union, at which point in time Philip II became king both of Spain, Castile and of Aragon and so forth, but also of Portugal and its overseas possessions. One of his initial promises there, but something that many people test, is to maintain the interior barriers between the Spanish and Portuguese empires. But immediately, people like Sassetti and later Carletti appreciate that the infrastructure of the Iberian empires would enable you to go all the way around the world. And key to that is this Macau, Manila, Acapulco leg. And it's that which Sassetti, a more law-abiding figure than Carletti, seeks permission to do, but to his misfortune, Sassetti dies in Goa in 1588 before being able to undertake the journey. Now, notably, Sassetti was planning on continuing to head east, whereas Carletti's journey went west, but the sites involved are almost identical. Neretti leaves an epitaph for Filippo Sassetti, praising that he had gone as a student of language, of mathematics, and of nature, which has made Sassetti an important figure for subsequent literary and scientific history of science scholarship and other things. Carletti is also filled with observations in his account, but is a much more practical merchant. And Sassetti, and in spite of his own bouts of illness, survives much longer. Sassetti dies at 46, and it's at that point in time that Neretti decides to stay in Asia, to establish himself in the Portuguese Empire, and therefore to be available to meet Francesco Carletti a decade later in Macau. About Neretti, we know actually a little bit more, because Neretti writes 2 letters back to Florence in 1617. So at this point in time, Carletti has been back in Europe for more than a decade, for a decade and a half, in Florence for just over a decade. And Neretti's first letter begins by calling Macau this last, nearly port of the world of China. And he wrote to say, we offer you 2 principal cities of this kingdom. The one, the court of the king, called Peking. The other, the traffic and fare of the Portuguese, called Canton, painted on 2 biombi, on 2 screens. The screens were supposed to travel to Goa in a great chest, to Fernando Crom, who is an Augsburg merchant, and then to Raffaello Fantoni or to Giulio Nessi in Lisbon. And as part of this story, this gift of screens for the Grand Duke, Neretti offers a brief account of his life. It says, "It pleased God that the youthful ardor of seeing new countries and people that I had never seen before. It's already 38 years since I left Tuscany, of which I spent some in the East Indies in the service of the King of Spain. Others I spent in this last part of the world, in China and Japan, and finally, laden with years and with a leg rendered useless by an arquebus ball fighting at sea with the Moors of Malabar, I remained as citizen in this city of Macau, port of China, with house, wife, and children." Okay. Well, you'll perhaps not be surprised at this point to see that Nessi and Fantoni are both Florentine patricians. Florentine patricians, indeed, who had been part of the original network with Filippo Sassetti decades earlier, is that they had established themselves in Lisbon and they offer part of the sort of commercial infrastructure, in this case, connecting China, India, Lisbon, and Florence. And these all operated within the sort of shadow of the broader Bocconi family businesses, about which I'm going to talk more later. But the key point here is that both Filippo Sassetti and Francesco Carletti are connected to the company. The second letter is what brings this sort of more directly into the Carletti story. And here, Neretti wrote to his brother, probably Bernardino, from Macau in 1617, that he had sent Cosimo II, quote, "a package of screens," this biombi, "which is a certain ornament in the manner of tapestry cloth, of which Messer Francesco Carletti can inform you." Okay, so nearly 20 years after meeting in Macau, Carletti is still there, at least in Neretti's imaginary, and we think also in practice, in Florence on the court roll, available to consult on what these screens are and how you use them. Neretti also relates information about his friends and family. He notes that Giovanni Battista Soderini, cousin persecuted by the various successes of fortune, had also ended up in Macau and brought good news about his family. And Soderini had made a voyage in what is now Cambodia and Cambodia, and is preparing to make another one to Bengal. But I do not yet have any record of that voyage or of what Soderini had written. On the lookout for that. We have sort of further, tenuous but very interesting evidence of Florentines engaged in commerce in Southeast Asia and what is now India and Bangladesh. He finally sends greetings to his sister-in-law, Emilia Rondinelli, and various relatives, and to Signor Michele Saladini, who's an important business contact of the Capponi family. And so what we had here then is a network, again, of very prominent Florentine families. So why? Why, after all these years, right back to Florence? So what does he want? And Neretti wants Cosimo II to intercede with King Philip III to, quote, make me a naturalized subject of the kingdom of Portugal and nobleman jointly with the habit of Christ, the order of Christ. And kind of remarkably, this play, by way of the Grand Duke, works. And in 1619, he does actually get Grand Ducal intercession and become a Portuguese fidalgo. But here we then have a sense of Orazio, whose vision of how to become a Portuguese nobleman runs through being an ostentatiously loyal Florentine. Which brings me then to my penultimate section on Carletti's return to Florence. And what Carletti is doing in Florence to be understood to be at the Medici court there to serve as a interpreter of global goods and global information for the Medici, a sort of global interpreter on retainer. And here we have some sort of new archival findings project. The first of these is a letter to Belisario Vinta, familiar to many, a major state secretary from Lyon on June the 22nd, 1606. And he writes, I received a letter of your lordship in Paris 2 days before my departure from that place. And therefore I did not reply to it, nor do what your lordship commanded me for the service and desire of his highness our prince, to whom I hope in his presence to be able to give greater satisfaction. So I was desired, and in consequence, I immediately went to the post and I came here. And today I leave for Turin, and from there I go on to Bologna. And if I find there is safe conduct from his serene highness, as I've asked and asked your lordship with this, I, without delay, will come straight to court to do what your lordship will command me and to serve his serene highness in whichever thing will be good, as I will desire and is my obligation. Yeah. One or two notable things about this is that this both corroborates the account of his journey back to the court in Florence that he leaves in the Ragionamenti, and also adds some key information that is missing from the Ragionamenti, from Carletti's account of his journey. He's posited his 12 daily presentations to the Grand Duke. That is the safe conduct. Happily, Florentine records, as again may be familiar to many of you at Forum, are extremely meticulous. We have both the draft of the safe conduct and the official safe conduct, which says that we, knowing that Francesco Carletti are Florentine citizens, no other intention and aim than to be able to satisfy the creditors of his father and his, and that for this he comes here so that he can do that with security. We concede to him ample safe conduct for his person to last 4 months from the date of it. So what we have here is some pretty important evidence, which is what I'd like to suggest, about some of the financial arrangements which go unstated and in fact never, as far as I'm aware, sort of interrogated. So how this journey happened, the tacit assumption has been that it was the Carletti's money, but this tends to suggest that perhaps it was not, and that in fact we may have been operating partners in a business. The exact details of their finances is something that I would love somebody to find, but I think that that's a thing that we need to look more for. Anyway, Carletti seems to have sorted it out, and in part that maybe because he's pretty well connected already at this point to key Medici agents, one, and contacts, friends. One of them is Abraham Luce, whom has a new dissertation just out. Excellent work already happening. So great research at the sort of an open frontier here. But there's a postscript in his letter of July 18th. It says, if you find Francesco Carletti there, I pray you to give him my recommendation and think a little of his friends and give them news of his well-being. Right? So Luce was based in the Dutch Republic. And we have here then some suggestion of the kind of life that Carletti built during his legal journeys, struggles in the Dutch Republic. You can also see that the Medici had originally intended Carletti for a number of projects. First, to serve on, perhaps command, the galleon that they had commissioned to the Dutch Republic before it's impounded. There had been ideas about Carletti serving in a similar capacity in France, which is why he'd been there in the first place, and which also does not work. And then here we have a sort of third idea. These are all sort of projects of the tail end of Ferdinando's reign, a period of many ambitious projects, as they're written about elsewhere. And here we can see this is part of this plan to send to the East Indies for our curiosity, and also to look for noble and exquisite stones for the service of the ornament of the Medici chapel. Some 4 or 5 men under the chief of them. As it turns out, we have in other patents and passports and more letters that we have made for this expedition, nominated by us, so as he was elected for that charge and care, Francesco Carletti, our vassal and Florentine gentleman, who is nonetheless substituted for Captain Cristoforo Pandolfini. I can see Francesco Carletti here. We have the sense then that in those 3 years between his return, or 2.5 years, and Ferdinando's death, that Carletti is imagined as somebody to send back to maritime Asia, to India, or perhaps beyond. To rebuild his fortune to serve as a Medici agent. But with Ferdinando's death, almost immediately thereafter, a different role emerges. Part of this is to do with the unstated impediments that prevent Carletti from taking that initial journey. What those are, it's not yet clear to me. But what is clear is that he's entered as steward of the household on 5th March 1609 at a quite handsome rate of 20 florins. And it's there that he remains on the court rolls for decades thereafter. So we then have a sense of Carletti as having returned to Florence. He's returned to Florence with Antonio, who then goes on to Rome. He's come with the Atlas, and the annotated Atlas, and he's come as a global expert, who the initial plan was to send back to do, direct commercial things. None of that actually pans out, and for reasons that I've written about elsewhere. And so instead, he's there at the Medici court at the same time as people like Jacopo Peri and, of course, more famously, Galileo Galilei, there to serve as a sort of interpreter of the global in Florence, amongst other things. And it's to do that that we are planning on doing an exhibition at the Biblioteca Laurenziana in the space that is at the end of this sort of extraordinary reading room in the Biblioteca Laurenziana. We have a couple of pictures here in the center and the right of the meeting that we had with the scientific board in June to evaluate possible objects and their placement in the existing cases. Now, the project we're calling Global Florence, the World of Francesco Carletti, 1573 to 1636. That is, as I mentioned, meant to be an exhibit at Laurenziana, and it will be from October the 8th of 2026 to January 8th, 2027. So that's already fixed. That's happening. And it's going to be organized around Francesco Carletti's journey. I'll go over the organization in just a second. But it's about Florence in the world and the world in Florence. It's not a biography of Carletti. There are a few objects, including the Atlas and a little description of China that Carletti has composed. during his time in Macau that are directly connected to him. But these are mostly objects that have direct connections to Florence and the Medici, which speak to this world attached to Florence in circa 1600. I suppose, like with the edited volume, uh, we are engaging deeply with Carletti and his life, but the story is not a biographical one. Instead, Carletti serves as a way to explore the global sort of circa 1600, a way to do so in a disciplined fashion, one that connects to a very specific and important time and place. Um, and of course, we are interested in the details of Carletti's life and his journey and so forth, but also as an opportunity to think more broadly about the early modern global at a really important moment of transition from one dominated originally by the sort of connections laid down by the Iberian empires and into to one in which the Dutch and English and others will play a much more important role. As for again, back to the exhibition, there are 28 cases in 4 rooms and tapestries on the walls. That is part of the package that Laurenziana has and which is generously shared with us. And we're currently expecting about 60 objects to go in there. This is, again, subject to that fine detail of crystallizing loans and dimensions and the exact depth of cases and state of conservation and insurance and all of those logistical things. So we're very close to having that list locked down. And so we've divided that into 8 themes, and it's those themes that I'd like to share with you in just a second. And then finally, we're planning on doing a catalog. A catalog in an English version and an Italian version. We suppose that there might be some people who want both the English and the Italian, but typically we assume one and the other, which will be published with Mandragora, worked previously with Laurenziana. Right. So, as to the exhibit. So we'll start with Florence and the Wider World, 1550 to 1650, and then follow Letty into the world of slaving from Seville, and in particular through West Africa, hoping to have some important objects from West and Central Africa. So you can imagine those are important and difficult to secure. So we will see. We'll then go to America's riches, to New Spain and Peru, and from there to Manila and then to Japan. So merchants and martyrs. We went to the merchant side in Manila and the martyrs in Japan. And then we'll sort of take a pause to a place that Carletti didn't actually go, but with which he has an unusually close connection, and that's the story of Antonio. Antonio, who in the 18th century censored version of Carletti's account was published, quite an incomplete one, censored amongst other things by cutting out Carletti's pretty extensive critique of slavery. It's in that version that Antonio picks up his last name, Correa, not as a toponymic, but personal cognomen, and which sets him on a journey that in a park, it's a marvelous essay in our volume, has laid out for us about Antonio Correa becoming an extremely important figure in modern Korean fiction. We'll also be engaging with the debates of the time about Korea as a peninsula or an island. So of course, we'll have the atlas there, both think about Korea and to think about China and the extraordinary Chinese materials present in Florence. So we have Gateway to China, commodities and cartography. We have equally rich materials from India, we're calling the marketplace of the world. And then we're going to go back to Europe to think about Florence in an age of empires, think about some of the other long distance connections that Florence has, and in particular the Dutch connections. We're hoping to borrow a few pieces from the influence. We hope that all plays out. Okay. In closing, since I know we're about full time and I'm at about full set here, I wanted to give a couple of indications as to the things we were planning sort of on top of the exhibit itself. And again, this is sort of subject to, we have a lot of funding in hand. We don't quite have all of it. And so the exact scope of that will be subject to slight revision depending on that all plays out. But we're planning on producing videos, a website, and educational materials for students in Florence. We're imagining in particular students in the local K through 12 system in Florence, but also international students there. This is the catalog. It will eventually be available through the Laurenziana's website. So we'll eventually have that as an open access piece. We're gonna host an opening event. Everybody loves a party, but also because we have the opportunity to really share the exhibit, and then sort of more substantively, we're as substantively, but on a more extensive basis, we're planning a lecture series at partner institutions in Florence. We have a few lined up, but if you'd like to be a partner institution, do contact me. But in order to elaborate particular elements of the exhibits, and also to sort of make people, especially study abroad students and others, aware that this is happening during their time in Florence, and to engage with them. And then finally, a project that I've been working on for quite some time, and we've been working on together, I've done a full transcription of the Ragionamenti, and I'm doing a translation of the Ragionamenti, and that is to replace the actually quite readable and enjoyable, but unfortunately not terribly accurate 1960s English translation, and to give people then the scholarly community and others besides a more reliable account of what he actually said. All right, we went through a lot in quick succession, but without further ado, I think maybe I will bring this to an end and switch to Q&A.
Thank you so much. This is perfect timing, and wow, what a fantastic research that is going on for this fantastic exhibition. So in a year from now, the exhibition will open, right?
Yes,
Okay,
that's right.
wonderful. Yes, wonderful. So I will get to my questions about the exhibition. But first of all, I would like to announce that Q&A is open. So please write your questions in the Q&A box so I can read them to Professor Brege. But I'm going to start with my own questions, if you don't mind. Yeah, so in what ways do you think that Carletti's global travels and the objects that he brought back to Florence um, reshaped the intellectual culture of the Medici court?
Oh, a very interesting one. We have some discussion here. I'm thinking about Paula Findlen's essay in the volume, which thinks about some of the ways that Carletti engages with sensing objects, with descriptions,
Mhm.
not only his astronomical descriptions, but his descriptions of natural history, which is, of course, it's, and living nature, of course, major preoccupations of the Medici court. We know that Carletti sent back, he sent back seeds from Japan, and that only one of the sets sent to Campodi grows, but it doesn't bear fruit, and he offers some explanation as to why. So we have some of these natural materials, but Paula has also heard some suggestion about connections between Carletti's sense of the senses and the Saggiatore, that Galileo's asset. And of course, he is present. He's not at the level of Galileo, not at the educational level. He's not at the level of pay, but he is present in a court which is not that large, and he seems to be available. We can see a couple of other places where he's sort of engaged. He writes memorandums on trade and things like this. The Giorgio has sort of identified one of these memorandum. He's sort of outside of the project. Another person outside of the project who's done great work on this is Emily Wilburn, has identified that Carletti is one of the figures who serves at the baptism for one of the only surviving one of the indigenous South Americans who are with the failed Tuscan English, really, Amazon expedition of 1600. So he's sort of there. And then we have, of course, Leo Marchi, who picks up on a section in Carletti's account, which helps us to date the revisions to the account, because it's sort of ambiguous as to which Grand Duke he's talking to. Sometimes it seems like it must be Ferdinando, since he thanks Ferdinando, thanks the Grand Duke specifically for the help he's given him. But other times he's making references to things that seem to have happened in 1615 or so. And one of these is an organizer of an important festival in the 16 teens, carnival festival about people from all over the world. And we think that, you have Carletti there at court. That, it seems not unlikely that he is sort of part of the conversation about, well, if you're going to have these things, he's been to many places, not by any means to all, but with Carletti and with Vecchietti and with a few others at court, you have some pretty reasonable coverage. Different sections of the world, and while, for lack of a better word, the Medici are playing dress up or doing these various things, right? That, what to make of the objects that they have, and of the people who are coming through. So, we have these sort of bits and pieces. We also know, he spent a lot of time in the Dutch Republic, and we have another piece here that engages with the Marchi has some wonderful things on this, on his role, apparently doing art collecting for the Medici in the Low Countries during the 16 teens. So he seems to be sort of available for doing things attached to various elements of the sort of expertise that he acquired.
Wonderful, thank you. So there is a question in the Q&A by Karen. Fabulous work. Can you tell us what kind of research, if any, has been done in early modern archives in China, Japan, and Korea to complement the research that you and other Italianists can comfortably carry out? And even if Carletti never made it to Joseon, Korea, do we have any documentation of Europeans getting there? Thank you.
So here I really have to rely primarily on our collaboration, which I think has been key to this project goal. So for Japan, we relied very heavily on the work of Miki Sugiura. And really her work there is mostly about comparing Carletti's account with other early accounts, Croatian others, to establish sort of how original and direct Carletti's account. Anna Harrison has done an essay engaging with Carletti's description of Chinese characters. So one of the very unusual things about Aggiornamenti is that it has both an attempt to engage with both Chinese characters and with some Japanese. He puts in tables. In the censored 1701 edition that's eventually printed is actually an important piece in spite of the censorship. This is one of the first that prints these characters in line with the text. It was an early piece in printing in Europe. So there's been, she's engaged as a scholar of China and of East Asia with some of the sort of comparative material there. And then Michele Bossotti, who's also a scholar, this one is really the ranking expert on the atlas. And her essay engages not just with the atlas and the text in Florence, but really with the portion that is not in Italian, but she has that. But with what this text is, right? That this is the Ming reprinting of a much earlier atlas. This is, of course, a European characterization of geography, as Coasty calls them. And where this fits within sort of Chinese publishing at the time. The sense we have is that the Carletti we do have a couple of archival traces of them. So Bartolome Uncasilla has found Carletti in Seville's archive, and we can find him in a couple of other places. The Carletti case shows up all over the Dutch archives, and Anna Harrison Mika Kablisek and Claudia Swan have done work in the Dutch archives. But the Carletti were smugglers at some level, and they're middling merchants. So we have the sense that they were really trying not to show up in local archival sources, and that they did not, as best they could. Of course, Macau is officially part of Ming China, but it is locally administered by the Portuguese, right? They try as much as they can to sort of not appear in local records. And of course, with the 26 people crucified still on the hills that they go up and see in Nagasaki, right? There are a lot of reasons why that might be a good idea. Right? So this is a turbulent time. And of course, in Korea, this is the Imjin War, right? We're right in the middle of it. This is of course why there are so many people, Koreans being sold in Nagasaki at the time. But we'd love to know more. Again, one of the big debates in Korea has been about whether the man in a Korean costume, which has been presented as a New Korea, sort of a Getty show, is or is not Antonio, or is it somebody else dressed in a Korean costume? But there's an early sort of European engagement with things Korean exactly this time. But that the sense we have is that there are a number of different art historical and historical scholarly communities. And our hope with this project, just to sort of close this here, is not to present the final word on Carletti by any means.
Of course.
We don't think we've actually gotten to the end of the archival road with this, but instead to encourage other people to go and follow up with it. They think things might be interesting.
Beautiful. So we have another question in the Q&A. Is there a longer story here from Charles V and Magellan in the early 16th century to Philip III and Carletti in the early 17th century in terms of global exploration, trade, and discovery campaigns?
Yeah, so I mean, Carletti, part of what's interesting about Carletti is that he's not a discoverer.
He's not a,
So
sorry.
not a
He's not
discoverer. He's not an
discoverer.
explorer. What he is he's an observant merchant who is in a lot of interesting places at the right time. So it's a pretty interesting time to be in Manila and Nagasaki and Macau. Maybe more than that, Carletti offers us a sense of how that world has changed in the less than 100 years since Magellan. And I'll give just two quick examples on this one. Carletti talks about going around the world as if you're looking at a globe or on a map, and about it's such a pity that there were all these disruptions, because the most wondrous thing the Spanish and Portuguese have done is made it possible for anybody like him, just a merchant, a middling person, to make the whole circuit of the world in 4 years. His vision. It's not how long it takes Carletti, but how long he thinks it should take, right? And on top of that, Carletti begins to think about puzzles. Thinks about what would happen if ships, he writes about, were to travel really fast. They have a following wind or something between Nagasaki, Macau, and Manila, because the Spanish and the Portuguese are counting time zone differences, as we would now put it. Of course, they don't have time zones at the time differently. And so they're off by a day between these areas. And so he thinks about this, of course, this is in the late 16th century in Christian terms, in terms of, could you have Christmas twice or some equivalent, right? Would you have a feast twice? Could you miss a fast? Right? But what he's thinking about, in effect, is a dateline. Right? And that's not something that had been possible in the era of Magellan or in the era of Charles V. What you need there is you need some pretty late foundations. And particularly you need Manila from the 1570s and Macau, Nagasaki. And those are things that are developed. These are really three news centers in the way that they are reconceived, not new in that nobody had lived there, but new in that they are reimagined as global ports between the 1550s and 1570s. And they make it possible that or sometimes maybe just Macau and Manila, to go around the world. But that might be my best take on that.
Wonderful, thank you. So I do have another question, and I understand that we only have 5 minutes, but I'm an art historian, so of course I think about the impact of these experiences, like global experiences, on the local artists. So do you think in any ways that the involvement or the engagements of the patrician families mediated in the translation of these global experiences into local artists?
I mean, again, here I'd have to to defer to my art historical and history of science colleagues, but one of the ways that I would point to is, we think about somebody like, and this is even before Carletti's journey, right? Jacopo Negozzi, these incredible, all the way through to the 1640s, right? And Florence, as Paula has noted, right, is an incredible citrus center. And some of that citrus comes from Japan, right? And some of it comes from, and that's not something you just order, right? We need people who are there, who are able to tell you about it, why it doesn't grow properly, et cetera. So it's not just enough to have the seeds. Filippo Sassetti is engaged in the same project. Francesco Giraldi, who's Portuguese governor in Brazil, but from a prominent Florentine family, is involved. There's a lot of people. So we have these plants, and then all of this nation depicting nature. But there's also, of course, and here we have to be perhaps slightly more speculative. But we do have these folding screens in Florence. Not 100% certain that we have, or at least I have yet to identify the exact screens that Loretti said. But we do have Chinese screens from that time period, including in the Argenti, I guess the Tesoro dei Granduchi now. And we do have somebody like Carletti in Florence who's able to tell you what they are, you're supposed to use them. And I think about somebody like Kate Lowe, who's on the advisory board for our Global Florence project here, and her work on provenance and possession, right? And how many objects made their way to Florence sort of stripped of their context. One of the advantages of having somebody like Francesco Carletti at court is that if you want it, and of course part of her work is to show that people don't always want it, but if you want to do the kind of contextualization that Neretti in his letters says, right, you can have not just the global objects, but people who had been there. And we can think about the Vecchietti or others, right, who had been in Saint-Laurent or in India, to say, like, well, what is this thing, right? What is the story that it's part of? What is it depicting? What is the artistic tradition? And of course, the flip side is that many of these objects, like the namban, the screens, in Japan are made as export goods, right? So that there's this way in which the objects are made with local traditions, but they're also made in response to this period. So that some of these objects are sort of neither of one tradition or another, but instead of that sort of merging. So, I mean, those would be a couple of places that I would point to, but I think that there's a lot more. I guess I'll take one last thing, which is, of course, whether or not it's a cover, and there's a sort of debate about this, but there's this expedition, which never, as far as we can tell, gets off the ground to go send these gentlemen that he's supposed to lead India. But what they're doing ostensibly is buying stones for the Medici Chapel, right, at Laurenziana, at San Lorenzo. So part of that too is that, like, if you're going to do Pietraduria, you need them to come from somewhere, and what you can do with them depends on what stones you have. And if you have access to India, of course, you have a much broader selection than you would otherwise, right? So we can think about stuff that comes, ideas that come, living stuff, raw materials for other things, sort of the broader. So my guess would be that it's in those sorts of details that we can see the artistic impacts.
Right. Thank you. We only have 1 minute, so I'm going to be very quick. I understand that there was an exhibition titled Islamic Art and Florence in 2018 in Florence. For that, the Islamic world of the Eastern Mediterranean, how does this volume and exhibition, complement that exhibition?
It's a great question. I'll be really brief about it. I mean, the heart of it is that Carletti doesn't go to the Islamic world to speak of. He does to a certain extent when he passes through Malacca and through India and places where there are, but not to any places that are ruled by powers. This is an important distinction between him and, say, those people who worked with the Medici Oriental Press. You can think of somebody like, the work on Le Vite delle Lettere, and I want to say 11 show at Laurenziana. And that one of the things we're hoping to include at the very end of the exhibition is a few pieces out of the Archivio di Stato and others on some of those other connections. And one way that we're going to do that and keep that connected to Florence is that, he is, Carletti is at the Medici court at the same time that, say, Bacardin and others who are seeking temporary refuge from sort of anti-Ottoman actions in Lebanon and elsewhere are present. And so we have a sense of them as overlapping there. But in some sense, we might see them as sort of slotting together, right? That Carletti's
Right,
world
right,
is about where you can go for the Spanish and Portuguese and unexpectedly Dutch connections.
right.
And that is in some ways kind of different than the world of, say, Michelangelo Corrai or with some of these figures who are his exact contemporaries, but who are setting out to Aleppo and to
Right. Right. Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. You've been patiently answering all our questions, and unfortunately, we're running out of time. But I'm sure me and others have more questions. So I have provided Professor Brege's email in the chat if you want to contact him directly, or if you want to reach out to me, and then I can forward your questions to him. Thank you so much, Professor Brege, for spending the last hour or so with us. We enjoyed your talk. Good luck with all the research and the exhibition, and we hope to see you in a year to talk more about this exhibition as it materializes.
it would be my pleasure. All right. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Have a great evening in Chicago, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Please join us again next Tuesday, same time, same link, for another great talk. Thanks everyone. Have a good night. Bye bye. Thanks, Professor. Bye.